In this video, I will teach you everything you need to know about Lego gears, including over 40 types of gears and gear parts, in which I will be showing you their names, number of teats, and how to use them. Let's start by naming their names and number of teats, starting with spur gears. The first and smallest gears we have is the 8-tooth spur gears. There are 3 different types of models: the old model, the reinforced model, and the no friction model. The old model looks like this, and the reinforced model looks like this. They're pretty similar except for the extra lines to reinforce the gear on the reinforced model. The no friction model is the same as the reinforced model, only that it can slide loose on axles. Moving on, we have the 16-tooth spur gears. There are 2 versions, the old one and the reinforced one. Next up, we have the 24-tooth spur gears, which also has 2 versions, the old one and the new one. And the last spur gear is the 40-tooth spur gear, the biggest Lego gear. Now we're going to take a look at some double bevel gears, like the 12-tooth double bevel gear, the 20-tooth double bevel gear, the 28-tooth double bevel gear, and after that we have the 36-tooth double bevel gear. Now let's look at the gear racks. First we have the 10-tooth gear rack, which measures a 1x4 brick. Then there's the 8-tooth gear rack, the 14-tooth gear rack, and the 22-tooth gear rack. This is a 30-tooth gear rack and it fits in this gear rack housing. You just need to put it in there. A cool trick you can do, if you add this pin at the bottom, you can make like a really cool Lego knife. It's actually really cool and realistic. Now for the bevel gears, we have the 12-tooth bevel gear, the 20-tooth bevel gear, the 20-tooth bevel gear with pinholes, and the 14-tooth bevel tick gear. Now we're going to take a look at worm gears. We have 2 types, the worm gear and the short worm gear. Notice that they don't have an amount of teats, but rather one spiral tooth. Now we're going to look at some clutch gears. This is a 16-tooth gear with clutch, then the 16-tooth gear with the clutch on both sides, and the 20-tooth double bevel gear with clutch on both sides. Let's look at some gear differentials. First we have the 24 16-tooth gear differential, the 28-tooth bevel gear differential with inner tabs and closed centers, the differential gear house, and finally the 28-tooth differential gear with round axle hole. Now let's look at some other gears. So first we have the knob gear, and as you can see it has 4 tooths but a little different. Then there's the 8-tooth gear with a 1.5L axle. You might have noticed that it has the same looks as a 12-tooth double bevel gear, but only that it has 8 teats. And finally, we have the 24-tooth crown gear. Now that you know all these gears, we're going to look on how to use them, starting with spur gears. But before we do that, please make sure to subscribe because these videos take a lot of time to make. For the no friction 8-tooth gear, it can slide loose on axles, but if you turn the gear, it also turns the axle. You kind of need to experience and find what you want to do with it. Also, before we continue, you can connect Lego gears on a beam using Technic pins with no friction ridges like this, or use Lego axles and add a bushing. Also, make sure it's not too tight and that the gear can turn loose. Now for the rest of the spur gears, they can all mesh together, which means to connect or engage with other gears in a line on a single beam. All gears can do this except one, the 16-tooth spur gears. Why is it not able to be used with other spur gears? Well, you see, gears have this thing called a diameter, which is the length of the line to the center of the gear that touches 2 points on the edge of the circle. Meaning some gears are bigger than others and some are smaller, and gears like the 16-tooth spur gear can't be meshed with other gears, except with other 16-tooth spur gears on a single beam. But we can fix that. You see, by adding another beam with plates under it, we can fix it, and now the gears are able to be meshed with each other. Now, this may occur again during the video with other gears like double bevel gears, but just experience what works best and do that. But just make sure that the gears are being well meshed and that they aren't too tight and malfunctioning like this, but also make sure that it can't skip teeth because it's too far away. Now, here are some things you need to know when using gears. Whenever you have two or more gears meshed together, it's called a gear train. The gear with the force is initially being applied to, like a crank or motor, is the driver gear, kind of like an input. The last gear of the gear train is called the driven gear, like the output. All the gears in between the driver and driven gear are called idlers. Also, when using spur gears, when two gears are being turned, they will go in opposite directions, either towards each other or away from each other. One gear goes clockwise, while the other one goes counterclockwise. This can be fixed by adding an idler. Now the driver and driven gear both go the same direction. A trick I like to use is to make sure that the driver and driven gear are both odd gears. These things we saw can also be applied to double bevel gears. Let's move on to double bevel gears. Double bevel gears are versatile, which means that they have many functions, like being able to mesh with each other on the same beam or in right angles like this, whether it's interior or exterior. Now, once again, certain double bevel gears can be meshed with other double bevel gears. Actually, if you take two of the same type of double bevel gear, they will not be able to mesh on a single beam. But like I mentioned earlier, we can just add another beam and plates under it to make them mesh with each other. Now, double bevel gears can be meshed in corners like this, which is something that spur gears can't do because it doesn't work properly. The way they mesh with each other depends on what you're building, so you'll just need to find out how to do it. By being in a right angle, the double bevel gears are now in perpendicular lines, but if they are on a beam in a straight line, they are in a parallel line. Before we move on, spur gears and double bevel gears can be meshed together if you add and adjust the beam. Anyways, let's move on to gear racks. Gear racks can be moved horizontally from left to right, or can be moved vertically going up or down. This is called liner motion. Because gear racks are not circles, they don't have a diameter. You might have heard the word rack and pinion, which describes the action of a gear meshed with a liner gear called a gear rack. If you turn the gear clockwise, the gear rack will go left, but if you turn the gear counterclockwise, the gear rack will go right. Unlike spur and double bevel gears, the gear rack will end at one point or no longer be meshed with the gear, since it's only a line, which is why you need to go back and forth constantly. Spur and double bevel gears don't have this problem because they can turn with no limits. The 10-tooth gear rack can be placed on bricks or plates. and can also be combined with others of its own on bricks or plates, and if you want to make it slide, you'll need a tile under it. Here's an example. For the 8-tooth gear rack, you can use a Technic beam arm and add something like this. Then add a 12-tooth double bevel gear and add an axle of your choice. This is the same for the 22-tooth gear rack. For the 14-tooth gear rack, you can connect it to a Technic beam arm using these pins. And for the 32-tooth gear rack, it fits in the gear rack housing. And if you want to add a pin at the bottom, you can make this really cool knife. Now let's take a look at worm gears. So first, the worm gear counts as one tooth spiraled along the central shaft. Now, here we have a gearbox and you can add a worm gear at the bottom and a 24-tooth spur gear at the top. And you can connect them with axles. As we can see, the worm and spur gear meshed right now are in perpendicular lines, except that they don't actually intersect because one of them is above the other. This is how it's supposed to look when perpendicular lines intersect with each other. If you turn the worm gear one full rotation, it will only move one teeth of the 24-tooth spur gear. This means you need to do 24 full rotations on the worm gear for the spur gear to do one full rotation. This is called gear ratio, which is something I will talk in another video. So if you don't want to miss it, make sure to subscribe. Now, a cool feature about the worm gear is that it's one directional. You see, if you turn the worm gear, it will turn the spur gear. But if you do the opposite by trying to turn the spur gear, you won't be able to. This is very useful for one-way mechanisms. And for the short worm gear, you kind of need to build something that can hold the worm gear and the gear you're using. Since, as you can see, it has a bigger diameter, which means it can't fit in the gearbox, which also makes it practically useless. Before we move on, if you put two worm gears like this and turn one of them, they will want to separate from each other, creating a self-destruct mechanism. And to show how strong they actually are, I'm going to bend this Lego Technic piece. So the worm gear broke a bit, and as you can see, the Technic piece is a bit damaged. Now let's move on to bevel gears. Bevel gears can only be meshed in right angles, like this. They cannot be used on a single beam like this. If you have 4 of them like this, the gears opposite to each other will turn in opposite directions. This means these two and these two are going in the same direction. The 12-tooth bevel gear and the 20-tooth bevel gear can both mesh together. As for the 20-tooth bevel gear with pinholes, it can be meshed with both 12-tooth and 20-tooth bevel gears. If you want this axle to go the same direction, the 20-tooth bevel gear with pinholes can be used as a neutral gear. If not, if you take two 24-tooth bevel gears, they won't be able to turn unless you use 2 separate axles. Yet again, it doesn't fix the problem and it still causes it to go 2 different directions. Or you could just do this. And for the 14-tooth bevel TIG gear, it can only be meshed with other gears of its own. Otherwise, it won't work. Also, this is a gearbox and it's for the 12-tooth bevel gears where you can make this, or that. Alright, so now let's look on how to use gear differentials. First, a gear differential allows the wheels on either side of the vehicle to rotate at different speeds, which is necessary for turning. As you can see here, if one wheel is unable to move, the other one still can. Now, the 24 16-tooth gear differential can only be driven by parallel gears since it does not have bevel gears. To use it, you need to add 3 12-tooth bevel gears like this. At the end, you should have something like this. To use the 28-tooth bevel gear differential, you need 3 12-tooth bevel gears and put them like this. It can only be driven by a perpendicular bevel or double bevel gear. For the 28-tooth gear differential, which by the way was made in 2020, uses the differential gear house. You need a total of 5 12-tooth bevel gears, which you put 1 here, 3 in the sides, and 1 on top of them. Then use the 28-tooth gear differential to clip it on the differential gear house. It can be driven perpendicularly or parallelly. Before we look on how to use them, let me show you a couple parts you will need to know. First, we have the Technic driving ring 2L, the Technic driving ring 3L, the Technic driving ring extension, the Technic driving ring extension 8-tooth, the gear shifter, and the Technic changeover catch. Now, let me explain what's the utility of clutch gears. As you can see, I have 4 gears, though 2 of them are clutch gears. If I turn the input axle, nothing happens, but why? Well, you see, the clutch gears aren't connected to the axle, so the axle can turn without the gears even though it's passing through. Now, this part is connected to the axle, so the axle turns with it, and on top of that there's a 3L Technic driving ring. So when the axle turns, all of this does. As you can see, there is a space in the gear, so the driving ring can fit in it. And when the driving ring fits in it, when the axle turns, it turns the driving ring, which turns the gear and turns the gear connected to the output axle. Now, as you can see, depending on which gear you're using, it changes the speed. For example, when we use the 22 gear, if you turn the input axle 1 full rotation, the output axle does 1.5 full rotations. But if we use the 16-tooth gear and turn the input axle 1 full rotation, the input axle does 1 rotation. This is known as gear ratio, but since this isn't the subject for this video, make sure to subscribe if you would like to see it in a future video. Anyways, now that you understand the basics, let's look at a few other things. You can use the 8-tooth Technic driving ring extension if a gear is a bit further and that the 3L driving ring can't reach it. Very important, do not use the regular Technic driving ring extension because it's not made to connect with the clutch gear. It is used to be connected to the 8-tooth driving ring extension. You can also use multiple 8-tooth driving ring extensions. If you're using the 2L Technic driving ring, just make sure you adjust what you built. Now, for the gear shifter, it basically lets you control a Technic driving ring like this. And for the Technic changeover catch, it also lets you control the Technic driving ring. Anyways, because these things can get very complex, let's move on to the final gears. First, there's the knob gear. You can use them either in parallel lines on a beam like this or in right angles. They can only be meshed with other knob gears and not with any other type of gear. Even though it might seem useless, it's actually used quite a lot in LEGO vehicles for certain tasks. Next, for the 8-tooth gear with a 1.5L axle, this is the only type of gear I actually don't really know how to use. because if you mesh it with any other type of gear, this is eventually gonna happen. It basically stops the other gear from turning, so I'm still trying to figure out why Lego made this. And finally, for the crown gear, it can be used like this in right angles and can be meshed with other gears. It's like bevel gears, so I guess you could just use bevel gears because like they're a lot better. Another useless gear. And for those who made it to the end, you now know how to use all of this. I really hope it helps you out, and if you would like to help me out, consider hitting that subscribe button if you enjoyed this video. Once again, thank you so much for watching this gear video, and I'll see you in the next one.